So how should you write your code now that you know that Angular's change detection runs a lot? Well, as I mentioned before, you should, for example, not put expensive calculations into your templates. The expressions that you use in your template bindings should be simple and straightforward. You should, for example, avoid calling functions there. Event bindings and signal reads are the exceptions, but you should avoid calling other functions here in string interpolations, for example. And if you're using getters, which in the end are also functions, methods, you should make sure that in there you're performing basic, efficient calculations. That's also why the pipe transformation values are cached by default, as I explained in the pipes section. Because pipes in the end are functions that are executed when your templates are being evaluated, and therefore by default Angular caches the results generated by those pipe transform methods. So that's something you should keep in mind, but that's not all you can do. Another optimization you might want to keep in mind when writing Angular code is that you should consider telling Angular if a certain event does not matter for change detection. And here's an example. In this counter component, I'll implement the onInit interface, which is imported from Angular core. This, as you learned, forces me to add the ngOnInit method. And in there, I'll now use the setTimeout function that's built into the browser. So that's not Angular specific, but instead comes from the browser. SetTimeout allows me to set a timer, for example, to 4 seconds, by entering that amount in milliseconds. And after this timer expires, this function here will execute. In here, we could then, for example, reset our count to 0. If I do that, you'll see that if I reload and I change the counter after 4 seconds, it will reset to 0 and change detection will run again. But now let's say we have a second counter here in the same component to keep things simple, which runs after 5 seconds, where I just want to log something or do something else that has no direct impact on the UI and the data we manage in this application. But here I'll just log something and say timer expired. So this is now a timer which, when it expires, technically won't have any influence on any template or any component because I'm not changing any data here. Nonetheless, you'll see that if you reload and you wait 4 seconds, the first timer expires, but if you then wait 1 extra second, this second timer expires, as you can tell, and change detection ran again. And it did run again because, as I mentioned before, your entire application is in that zone.js zone, which under the hood listens to all kinds of events. For example, also expired timers, and it then triggers Angular's change detection mechanism. Because Zone.js does not look into your code here and see that this code won't have any effect on any data or component. Instead, Zone.js just sees that the timer expires, and that could potentially mean that something changed, and therefore it tells Angular to run change detection again. That's why for situations like this, Angular gives you a tool that allows you to opt out of change detection, or to opt out of the Zone.js watch mode for this code here, for example. And to use this feature, you have to inject something into the component where you want to opt out. You have to inject a value, which I'll store in a property called zone, though the name does not matter. And I'll inject with the inject function, but you could also use the constructor, of course, as always. And the injection token here is ngZone. And that's provided by Angular, and that's in the end a class token. It's a class I'm injecting here, like a service. And it is, in the end, a service that gives me a method that allows us to opt out of Zone.js watch mode for some specific code. So here in the place where I have this code, I can now use this zone property and call the run outside Angular method. And to this method, you have to pass a function which then wraps the code that should be executed outside of Angular's change detection, you could say, or outside of the Zone.js watch mode. And with that, this code will not be watched by Zone.js and change detection will not be triggered when this timer expires. And that is an optimization you will probably not need too often, but sometimes it could be important and it could be helpful because it can help you avoid unnecessary change detection cycles. So here in this case, if I reload and we then wait, after 4 seconds, the first timer expires, and then after 1 second, the second timer. And as you can see, I now only get that timer log, but not the log from all these components, because now indeed change detection wasn't triggered. This is, by the way, a concept that's also known as avoiding zone pollution, because you're not polluting Zone.js with events that don't matter in the end. So avoiding expensive function calls and potentially opting out of Zone.js and therefore change detection with certain pieces of your code can be helpful. But there is an even more powerful strategy you can use in your Angular applications, which can tremendously improve the performance of your applications, depending on how you use it and how your application is structured. Because besides this default strategy, where for every event everything is checked for changes in the entire application, besides this strategy, Angular also has an alternative change detection strategy called the onPush strategy. And this is an opt-in strategy which you can enable on a per component basis to make sure that change detection potentially runs less often for the given component. So let's enable it and let's then understand how it works. Here I'll go to the messages component, which is the component that outputs the new message and the messages list components in the end. And in that messages component, I'll opt into this onPush strategy by going to this decorator configuration object. And there you can set the change detection property to change detection strategy, which is an enum that must be imported from Angular core. Change detection strategy dot onPush. Default is, you guessed it, the default, but onPush is now that opt-in mode that can be more efficient. And we can see the effect of this strategy when using it here in the messages component right away. If I reload my application here and I wait for that reset counter to occur, which resets my count value here, you see I still get a lot of logs here. But if you take a closer look, there isn't a single log from the messages component, the new message component, or the messages list component. And the same is the case if I increment or decrement the counter. And let's compare that to what we had before with the default strategy, which you don't need to set, by the way, since it's the default. But here I will set it temporarily. And if I do use that default strategy, you'll see that now as that counter expires here, we got logs from messages, new message, and messages list. And these logs are missing when using onPush. If we use that strategy, and again, we wait for that counter to expire, you'll see that logs from these components are missing. And why is that the case? What does onPush do?